From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hi, everyone. I'm Betsy Peterson, and I'm the director of the American Folklife Center. And on behalf of all of the staff, many of whom are here today, I see, I want to welcome you all here to the Library of Congress and to the latest Botkin Lecture Series lecture. The Botkin Series is a great opportunity for the American Folklife Center to present the latest scholarship in folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, cultural heritage studies, and the like. It allows us to accomplish a couple of things. One, it allows us to expand and enrich our collections. All of the lectures that are given here are tape recorded, and thank you to all the wonderful folks in the back for doing all of this. And eventually make their way onto our website so that people around the world and future generations can hear these important words and stories and observations. So with that said, if you have anything turned on, please turn it off, any cell phones and the like. Today I have the honor of introducing, as part of AFC's year-long celebration of Alan Lomax's centennial, the centennial of his birth, I have the honor of introducing Nathan Salsburg. Nathan wears many hats. He is a virtuoso guitarist and accomplished songwriter, performer, and recording artist, but another hat that he wears is being the curator of the Alan Lomax archive at the Association for Cultural Equity, based in New York, although he is based in Louisville, Kentucky. The Association for Cultural Equity was founded by Alan Lomax in New York City in 1983 with the express purpose of, to quote, to explore and preserve the world's expressive traditions with humanistic commitment and scientific engagement. Although Lomax's physical collection is now located here at the American Folklife Center, which is a wonderful honor for us, ACE, however, under the direction of Alan's daughter, Anna Lomax Wood, retains the rights to the collection and continues to serve as custodian of the Alan Lomax archive. ACE's mission is to facilitate cultural equity through preservation, publication, and repatriation of Lomax's materials. ACE practices cultural feedback by freely distributing thousands of recordings, photos, and videos through their website and various social networking outlets. It also works in partnership with institutional and educational partners throughout the country, and through its global jukebox label, ACE maintains an active publishing arm and repatriates artist rights and royalties to their estates and families. It returns copies of its media collections to those who created them and to their communities of origin. Because of AFC's close connection to ACE, or the Association of Cultural Equity, we've come to think of Nathan and really all of the staff there as sort of auxiliary or extended staff members of the American Folklife Center. So today, Nathan is going to talk about a couple of moments or trips that Alan Lomax did, two portions of his collecting journeys. One is his 1959 Southern Journey field recording trip and his later video recording project, American Patchwork. And so with that said, please give Nathan Salsburg a warm welcome.
Thanks, everyone. So I do get to say, is this thing on? I was hoping I would. Thank you. Thanks a lot to Betsy and everyone at the AFC who is always so generous with their time and expertise, and certainly being flexible, in particular with me with regard to the Botkin. I had to cancel a March engagement due to illness, so thank you for coming today, and to everyone at AFC for being flexible to reschedule. I wanted to start with to tell you a few years ago, I did something similar in Moscow in Russia. I was invited over to talk about Lomax's collecting with regard to preserving site-specific vernacular culture to a group of independent radio journalists across Russia, which you can imagine is a thankless task, getting more thankless all the time. And their annual conference was being held in Moscow, and my host was an American journalist who has been stationed there for a number of years named Charles. And he said I would have 40 minutes to talk, 20 minutes of those would be in translation. And I was to introduce Lomax and his work to people who had probably never heard his name before. So I said what I was going to do is probably give a series of firsts, as it's easy to do in Lomax's career. Talk about, the first recordings that were made in the Southern American penitentiaries, the first recordings made on reel-to-reel tape in the field, the first field recordings we broadcast over American Airways, et cetera, et cetera. I said, is that going to be enough for these people? Just a series of firsts. And he said, well, Russians love firsts, so even if they'll have no idea you're talking about, they'll really appreciate that perspective, especially if it's at the, to the detriment of the seconds and thirds. So, I mentioned it's interesting because I talked about Woody Guthrie, I talked about Leadbelly, I talked about Jelly Roll Morton, and no one really had any idea who I was talking about, but they did seem to take the notion of cultural equity and the notion of not just documentation of expressive traditions, site-specific expressive traditions to heart, but also the idea of the dissemination of them, both preservation and dissemination and promotion of the material. And that's sort of what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to give you a number of sort of firsts in Lomax's career that I think are worth talking about, and then sort of pivot a bit into discussing what we do, what he did as a media activist, basically, and then talk a bit about what we do at the Association for Cultural Equity to preserve and to promote his mission in the digital age. So there are a number of firsts that I could have talked about that I'm not going to talk about today. And one of them being here at the AFC was Lomax was at the helm of the newly established library's recording lab in 1942 to issue recordings made under the auspices of the Archive of Folk Culture here. Fascinating for me, incredible material on these records. Could have talked about those, I'm not going to, but I wanted to show you. I want to address them. Lomax was also a prolific radio presenter and producer and scriptwriter from the late 1930s here in DC through the 40s on CBS and Mutual Broadcasting System into the 1950s on the BBC and Radio Aaron. We're going to address his radio material just for a moment here in a second, but we're not going to spend too much time on it. And of course, there's Lomax's very first recording trip that he made with his father, John A., in 1933. It was a two-part project insofar as that the initial intention of the trip was to compile material for what became this book through Macmillan Publishing, American Ballads and Folk Songs. And luckily, the Library of Congress and their sort of burgeoning archive of folk culture had the foresight to furnish them with a portable disc recording machine that was it was not the first recordings made for the archive, but the Lomaxes in 33 and 34 enlarged the holdings here exponentially. And this is obviously, we could spend many hours just discussing the first summer that 17-year-old Alan spent with his father in the American South in 1933. And then there's this record, which gives my talk its name, this 1947 album. This is the later LP release. It was originally released as a 78 album called Listen to Our Story. It was compiled by Alan for Decca Records, who had hired him in 1945 to serve as producer of something they were calling the Folk Music Series. And he started out with relatively safe, and I think safe to say in 2015, milquetoast releases of folks like Josh White and Richard Dyer Bennett and Burl Ives. But after a couple years of this, he decided that it would behoove him to dig into the massive collections of Decca Records, who at that time were sitting on the archives of the Brunswick and Vocalion labels as well, who had produced untold numbers of commercial 78 RPM records in the late 20s and 1930s for sale exclusively in what were called the hillbilly or old time and race markets of vernacular black and white music. And this was not the first re-release of commercially recorded pre-war material. That was a 1941 album called Smoky Mountain Ballads that Alan compiled for his father and was released by RCA Victor. But this is the first one that I know of that combined both black and white vernacular material from the commercial label's archives. It came out in 1947. alongside of another record called Mountain Frolic. And this was also the first time this material was available for, in mass market, so to speak. A big American record label was behind it and being pitched primarily to urban audiences. Another interesting thing about this that I find fairly radical is that it came with a sing-along book. So the idea was that you could, I think this is the first time, I'm sure the last time that anyone was able to buy a record that included Doc Boggs, Furry Lewis, and you could sing along with the pamphlet that came with it. Of course, Harry Smith would follow a similar tack a few years later with combining both black and white Cajun material in his anthology of American folk music. Charles Seeger reviewed this set in the Journal of American Folklore when it came out alongside the Mountain Frolic volume. And he wrote that it could be said of the reviewer, could be said of himself, that, quote, he should take Allen to task for evidence of a distinct weakness in his valiant championship of folk music in the modern world, a tendency to sentimentalization of the folk and of the social and cultural role he believes it is playing. And he concluded on what he called a hopeful tone. If popularization of Anglo-American folk music never strays farther from its serious study than in these efforts, we have much to be thankful for. So I'm aware that addressing the purported sentimentality that Lomax brought to bear on his work could very easily take up this hour and many more hours. But I think it's important to give a nod to what that sentiment motivated, which I think arguably was the arc of Allen's career, his 7 decades recording in the field. In 1950, he was at a meeting of the, I want to give you the exact name because I always forget what it is exactly. The Mid-Century International Folklore Conference at IU. And he made what I think is sort of the most salient point of his career. And he said, we as folklorists, and we do folklore because we like folk stuff. We like folklore, or we like who it comes from. And if, that's sentiment, then so be it. But I wanted to give you sort of a creation narrative that Lomax pointed to a number of times in his life. He told a few of these that were sort of eureka moments for him, but this one's my favorite. But before I do, I actually did want to address his radio career in a particularly sort of Lomaxian segment, full of sentiment, from his 1948 Your Ballad Man program, which was broadcast on the Mutual Broadcasting System. And you are welcome to sing along as you are instructed to do here.
Well, let's start our program of nonsense song with that serious ballad describing how the tree grew out of a hole in the ground. It's going to be sung for us by Josh White, and it'll be a good idea if we'll all just sort of sing along with him. Come on, Josh.
Once was a hole.
Once was a hole.
Said it was a hole.
Said it was a hole.
Once was a hole.
Once was a hole.
In the middle of the ground.
In the middle of the ground.
Now
Hole in the ground, and the green grass grew all around, and the green grass grew all around. Come on now.
in that hole.
In that hole.
I'm sure that was plenty for you. It's really wonderful. If you listen to these old programs, and a number of them do survive, Allen really cannot help himself but just leap into the songs as they're being broadcast live over the radio. Sometimes he makes them better, sometimes he doesn't. So we've seen this already. As I said, this was the first of 4 books that Allen and his father produced between 1933 and 1941, I believe. And the intention of this book, which also included musical notations by Mary Gresham, was to get America singing America's songs. And it was on this trip, again in the summer of 1933, when Allen and his father visited a place called Smither Farm in sort of the northern tip of Walker County, Texas, above Huntsville. And they were looking for what John A. called made-up songs, songs not learned from records, not learned later from the radio, not learned from printed materials. The farm manager basically gathered all of the African-American sharecroppers into a schoolhouse on the farm under some perhaps nebulous threat to come and share their songs for these 2 guys from D.C. And Lomax sort of sheepishly, Lomax the son, Allen at one point sort of sheepishly asked if anyone knew the ballad of Staggerlee, which you could imagine 17-year-old Allen was interested in sort of the bad man material. Even at this age, he was sort of radical and had radical tastes. And an older gentleman, there's sort of a rustling, and finally this older gentleman who went by the name of Blue stood up and he said, I know that song and I will sing it if first I can do one of my own. And the farm manager said, is it made up? And he said, I reckon it is. I made it up in the field this afternoon. And he proceeds to sing this song, identified, we would call it Poor Farmer, basically outlining the iniquities suffered by the sharecroppers in rural Texas. And he ended it by saying, and I'll quote him, this is the way Alan documented it later, he began to address the president, thinking that perhaps his words would be carried back to D.C. by the Lomaxes. And he said, now, Mr. President, you don't know how bad they're treating us folks down here. I'm singing to you and I'm talking to you, so I hope you will come down here and do something for us poor folks in Texas. Actually, the audio of this does not survive, but even if it's apocryphal, it had a profound impact on Alan. And he recalled the experience in 1979, saying, when the record was over, we played it back, and there was immense joy in this group because they had felt they had communicated their problem to the big world. They wanted those people at the other end of the line to hear what life was like for them. That's why they were singing for us. They wanted to get into the big network. That experience totally changed my life. I saw what I had to do. My job was to try and get as much of these views, these feelings, this unheard majority onto the center of the stage. So I'm going to sort of scramble past the rest of his recording career, Lomax's recording career for the library, and also sort of most of the 8 years he spent on his European sojourn, 1950 to 1958. And those years were initially motivated by the blacklist. His colleagues, Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, were of course feeling the heat, and Alan decided to leave, and he initially was encouraged, if not financially, then at least in just terms of having an outlet by Goddard Liebenson, who was at the time the director of, Lee Burson, excuse me, the director of Columbia Records and their Masterworks series. And Alan had an idea to take advantage of newly released, state-of-the-art, long-playing records for folkloric purposes. And he actually addressed that conference I told you about earlier, the Mid-Century International Folklore Conference, saying that this medium provided, sort of unforeseen or previously unavailable opportunities to release folkloric recordings to a mass market. And he was greeted apparently by yawns. No one had any interest in this whatsoever. The one person who did was Charles Seeger, and which apparently made Alan furious. So he took it to Goddard Lieberson, who said, we'll be happy to do this, but you're going to have to find funding for it yourself. And John Schwed, who wrote the book The Man Who Recorded the World, his biography of Alan a few years back, he lists the funding sources that Lomax managed to cobble together for his European trip, and I'll give you a couple of them. Among them were $250 in royalties from Alan's Jelly Roll Morton biography. There were $600 from a show at the Music Inn in Greenwich Village that Alan performed and emceed with Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, and Reverend Gary Davis. And as John A. Lomax had died a couple years earlier in 1946, there was $4,000 of inheritance from John A.'s estate that he could take with him. And Schwed, I think, very well describes this arrangement, which he said seems tenuous. Although it seems tenuous, it would nonetheless turn out to be this way, the way he lived, Alan, for the rest of his life. He would become a one-man foundation, operating without benefit of the usual academic credentials and support, stepping uneasily between the world of commerce and entertainment and the abstemious, hermetic life of scholars. And Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, and an earlier admirer and supporter of Alan Lomax, would later say this, which I think is wonderful. Oh, there's the World Library of Folk and Primitive Music, the first volume. One of the reasons that Alan has made enemies is that he has done most of his research on money that he's made himself out of the folk field. That's a fatal thing to do in this country. He's not only made money, but he won some fame and prestige and delighted other people. That's even worse. So in 1957, at the end, more or less, of Lomax's recording career throughout Europe, Ireland, he was in England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Spain, and Italy. In 1957, of course, Joseph McCarthy had drunk himself to death, and in 1958, Alan came back to New York City to find that there was a folk revival in full bloom in Greenwich Village. And let it be said that before he came back, Alan had a profound influence on what became sort of the folk revivalism of England and Scotland in particular. His broadcasts on radio and TV over the BBC really can't be overstated, the impact they had in bringing both American music and native British music to listeners. And certainly the young players who were then starting skiffle groups and would later become members of the so-called British invasion to America. He also did events like the People's Festival Ceilidh in 1951, part of the Edinburgh Fringe Festival. That was the first opportunity. He produced it with Hamish Henderson, the great folklorist and poet and translator, who served as MC. And it was the first opportunity that many urban Scots had to hear traditional singing, both from the Gaelic-speaking Isles and also from the lowlands. And it was, if you listen to the tapes, and Lomax recorded them, there is this unbelievable applause at the end of most of the performances. So much so and so sustained that Lomax had to run the faders down and stop the tape because most of the tape was going to the applause. These sort of events were Lomaxian, I would say, insofar as that they were an attempt to not present mitigated material like the BBC had been doing for years by taking folk songs and arranging them in string quartets, but to provide, the real, as Hamish said, the big stuff to people on the stage. And again, so when he came back to the States, there was this American version of the folk revival sort of in full bloom, crowds of young banjo players and fiddlers and guitar players and gathering in Washington Square Park, having learned tunes by and large, shouldn't say by and large, but in no small part from the Lomax's books and records compiled in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And of course, in 58, when he got back, the Kingston Trio had a #1 hit with Tom Dooley, based on the murder ballad collected by Frank and Ann Warner in North Carolina by Frank Prophet. And the young revivalists were not only singing the songs that Lomax had recorded, but they were becoming fluent on their instruments, and bought at places like Izzy Young's Folklore Center, where they also went and looked at books and listened to records. And they had access to thousands of songs that Lomax had collected, and that was the idea, right, to get Americans singing American songs. And Pete Seeger announced in Sing Out, one of the burgeoning folk music magazines at the time, and a great resource for the young revivalists. I won't show you that yet. Pete Seeger announced in Sing Out that Alan Lomax, considered by many America's foremost folklorist, left the U.S. an enfant terrible and returns a legend. I welcome back Alan Lomax not just because he is an old friend, but because he is more responsible than any other single individual for the whole revival of interest in American folk music. Seeger finished that piece with a description of the moment that Lomax had returned to and the somewhat uncomfortable and unique place that Lomax had in it, saying, "Well, of course, the folk song revival did grow and flourishes now like any happy weed, quite out of control of any person or party, right or left, purist or hybridist, romanticist or scientist. Alan Lomax probably looks about him a little aghast." And next summer, so the summer of 1959, Lomax wrote his own article for Sing Out that blasted Seeger's notion of the happy weed, saying that the revivalists might pick a banjo or boast fluently or boast a large repertoire of songs, but that the songs are being, quote, ripped out of their stylistic contexts, and although they're sung, quote, well, they are at best changed. Lomax said, "It would be an extreme form of cultural snobbery to assert, as some people do, that they have been improved. In my view, they have lost something, and that something is important." Writing in 1993, he was much more blunt, saying that some of the young folkniks who dominated the New York scene asserted that there was more folk music in Washington Square on Sunday afternoon than there was in all rural America. Apparently, it made them feel like heroes to believe that they were keeping a dying tradition alive. The idea that these nice young people, who are only just beginning to learn how to play and sing in good style, might replace the glories of the real thing, frankly horrified me. I resolved to prove them wrong. So in that summer of 1959, I guess earlier than that, he began making arrangements for a field recording trip throughout the South that would take advantage of the newly released state-of-the-art stereo tape. And to find the support that he needed to do the trip, he approached not any sort of institutional or folkloric sponsor, but Amit and Nishui Erdogan, who were behind Atlantic Records, who at that summer, in the summer of, would have been 58, the summer of 58, had massive hits on stereo tape, the likes of Ray Charles, The Drifters, Bobby Darin. And they had begun recording in stereo. Excuse me, that was 59 when those records came out. They had begun recording in stereo in 59. And they, obviously, the Erteguns felt a great investment in and appreciation of American rhythm and blues. And they felt that this would be an excellent opportunity to make some connections between what was happening on the pop scene and also obviously in rural parts of America. And Lomax, with the young English folk singer Shirley Collins, left in the late summer of 1959 to head south. And over the course of 2 months, they recorded in Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, making over 50 hours of recordings on stereo tape. And the project was shorter at that point of any earlier discrete trip of Lomax's career. But its results, I think, ultimately were perhaps the equal of any other one, if not greater. And for Alan, it was a really important trip in a number of ways, but one of which was because it provided the opportunity to finally capture in sort of full sonic complexity some of the traditions that he tried, and as he felt, failed to document in years earlier, such as the Georgia Sea Island Singer ring plays that he had recorded in 35, the Parchment Farm work songs that he and his father had recorded from 33 into the late 40s, and of course the 4-part hymnody of the Sacred Harp that he had recorded in 42. And of course, he also made the first recordings, the debut recordings of the great guitar player and singer Fred McDowell from North Mississippi. And when Lomax returned to New York in late October of 59, he prepared 7 LPs for the Ertegun brothers in Atlantic that were released early the next year under the name Southern Folk Heritage Series. And what Atlantic Records didn't want, he gave to the upstart label Prestige that had been doing a number of folk titles in the late 50s, and they were issued as the Southern Journey series. And some of the academic and folkloric establishment were aghast, looked around and were a little aghast at Lomax's continued insistence on wearing both sort of the scholarly and also sort of the producerial hat at the same time, being a folklorist and a commercial record producer. But his primary intention, I think, with the Southern Journey trip was not just documentation, but the presentation of the material in what would be certainly its biggest presentation to date in terms of the media and also in terms of the audience that it met. And Atlantic's sponsorship also meant that it would find an international audience reaching far beyond the labels that were currently doing this sort of work, like Folkways, who had released his 2 volumes of his 1954 and 55 Italian recordings, the Westminster label, who had released a series of his Spanish material in the late 50s. And it also meant that Atlantic's involvement could help, again, draw connections between what was currently being listened to by teenagers all across the country with what was still a very much thriving vernacular, many thriving vernacular traditions in sites across the South. And Lomax made a point to the New York Post before he left that I love this. And he said, "I'm sticking up for rock and roll because even though some of it is destructive and crude, it is essentially a creative American impulse." And I like to think of this as being somewhat of a vindication of his father's role too, because when John A. released his Cowboy Songs book in 1910, many reviewers dismissed it as so much crudity and trash. And of course, the Southern Journey also gave Lomax the opportunity of pointing to Washington Square and saying the thing that you think allegedly is yours, and now that you are the standard bearer for, is very much alive in the places from whence it came. And not just that, but that the players who were making the music had roles to play in the revival. And so he worked with the Newport Festival Board to put on folks who were recorded on the 59 trip, such as the ballad singer from Arkansas, Almeda Riddle, Fred McDowell, the multi-instrumentalist from Southwest Virginia, Hobart Smith, fife blower Ed Young and his drum corps from North Mississippi, and certainly, perhaps more than all the others, Bessie Jones and the Georgia Sea Island Singers. They all became frequent performers at festivals and revival events and deeply influential figures of the period well into the 1970s and 80s. And in particular, the collaboration between Alan, his sister Bess Lomax Hawes, and Bessie Jones, I think, deserves a Bakken of its own, what being sort of this perfect synthesis of education and activism and cultural preservation and commerce, such as it was, releasing records and making money off of festival events or nightclub bookings like the Ash Grove in California. Alan, sitting on the board of the Newport Folk Festival, also saw that some of the money being raised at these events could go back into folkloric documentation projects. And you could look at the Ralph Rinzler, Mike Seeger, John Cullen collections here at the library for evidence of that. And here's how Lomax remembered the trip in 1993. This was 1959, and I finally had German mics and a Cadillac of a recorder and was doing stereo, the first stereo field recordings made in the South. You should hear the recordings. For me, a life's dream realized. So I'll play you something now from the Southern Journey, an instance of something that I think, and I would like to be told wrong if I am, but that was the first time anyone outside of the site ever heard this sort of thing. And this is the preaching of a fellow named I.D. Back, who was an elder in the Indian Bottom Association of Old Regular Baptists in southeast Kentucky. The fellow pictured as a fellow named Manus Eisen. And this was released actually on one of the Atlantic volumes.
With the truth as it is in Christ Jesus Lord. Oh God, I pray for there on tomorrow. God would remember us when how we need church in the church. Our Lord will pay the tower with sin brethren too. Oh my God, with a message from heaven how to feed our soul. Oh Lord, pray, oh God, it won't be long till all the brethren will be sitting around and we'll have all of the associations together. Oh God, I pray, Lord, that all that won't be, God will be with them, Lord.
These were also the first recordings made here in southeast Kentucky of Old Regular Baptist lining hymns that, of course, were documented many years later by Jeff Todd Titan and released in those two incredibly beautiful volumes on Smithsonian Folkways. I want to play you something else, as you can go onto the ACE website and hear that. You can hear the next thing, too, but it might be harder to find. Something that didn't make the cut of the records and was never recorded to be released, obviously. But it's one of my favorite bits of audio in the Lomax collection, in some. And it was recorded on this machine called a midge tape, which was a precursor of the dictaphone, off of the radio as Lomax and Shirley drove from Huntsville to Scottsboro, Alabama. And this was over WEUP Huntsville, which was Alabama's first black-owned and operated radio station, which had launched a year earlier in 1958. I actually went to try to find this fellow you're going to hear. He was a DJ named DJ Daddy Cool. Tried to track him down. The radio station is still around, but they unfortunately had no interest in fielding my request. But you can hear him read the news and then do the next thing he does.
Khrushchev will ride in the Tu-114 turbo Russian jet at Andrew Air Force Base. He will have his family and some 40 other racial officials with him. President Eisenhower will meet him, probably read his preparation greeting. Then the two will motor 15 miles back to the Blair's house, just across the street from the White House. Khrushchev make his first White House call, then Mr. Eisenhower has allotted 90 minutes to Khrushchev. The pair will be alone except for interpreters, and Haggard said the talk could run longer if necessary. Given the impression the East and West leader will get down to solid talk immediately. Ladies and gentlemen, you just have heard the 4 o'clock latest edition of the Worldwide News, which is compiled and edited here in the studios of WEUP. And your reporter have been Daddy Cool. Yes, sir, Daddy-O's and Mama-Yo, let's get back on the scene. I hope y'all get what I mean. I said shoot the juice to my loop, but just don't overload. I'm just like the porter when he was swinging them off. It's getting good to me, boss, and I can't stop. Don't worry about the weather. Let's get together, let our hair down, and do a little weave pulling around. Yeah, gonna play this number here by Ivy Johanna. This is dedication go out for Mr. and Mrs. Jackson. That's right. Mr. and Mrs. John Jackson, they say they go for this number the most. They heard Sugar Daddy play it a couple of times. And I thought I'd go in the stack there and get it out for you, Mr. and Mrs. Jackson. Ivy Johanna, and I love you so much. Come here, John. I love you so much.
DJ Daddy Cool, September 12th, 1959. So Lomax's next field recording trip after the Southern Journey was his very extensive canvass of the Eastern Caribbean under the auspices of the Rockefeller Foundation and the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. In 1962, made many very beautiful color photographs as well as I think about some 60 hours of audio recordings. In the rest of the 60s, he visited Soviet Union and Romania in 64. He went to Morocco in 67, the Dominican Republic and the tiny island of St. Eustatius in 1969. And the primary intention of these trips seemed to have been to gather materials for his deepening research into his cross-cultural performance style analysis, the intersection between performance style and culture that ultimately took expression in the choriometrics and cantometrics projects that I will not begin to discuss. It's fully out of my pay grade. But I will say that I think that these extremely ambitious undertakings were really at bottom sort of fundamental expressions of his activism, whereby he sort of insisted to the anthropological establishment that expressive culture wasn't ancillary to culture, but it was the soul of it, it was the expression of it, and that expressive culture and all of its sites around the world, site-specific iterations of it, were being annihilated by this homogenized, industrialized, one-sided communication system that drowned out what Lomax later called, I love this phrase, the generators of the original, and that a two-way communication balance needed to be restored. Is what he called cultural equity. This is a really wonderful clip from an unedited Charles Kuralt interview in 1991 where he explains this much better than I could.
Found out that what I was really doing and my father was really doing was giving an avenue for those people to express themselves and tell their side of the story. And I think that's what a folklorist is. I think that's what an anthropologist is or should be. I've become an anthropologist in the process. And I think our job is to represent all the submerged cultures in the world. I mean, you and your CBS and all the big amusement industries represent a way of silencing everybody. You know, communication was supposed to be two-way, but it's turned out to be basically one-way. From those people who can afford to own a transmitter, which costs a few $1 million, to the little guy who can afford to own a receiver that costs a few bucks. So there are millions of receivers and people at the other end and only a few transmitters. And I think that is one of the major, if not the major human problem now. Because everybody is off the air. They used to be on the air, you know, Charlie. You go out and you've been out looking at all those folks. My view of it is that not very long ago, there were hundreds of little separate communication worlds. I call them little bubbles of song and delight and ways of life and cookery and everything that existed everywhere. Literally hundreds of thousands of these little generators of the original. And suddenly all those delicate structures are being smashed and scattered and suppressed by an overpowerful, over-rich, overreaching communication system. And that's true in our country, it's true in Europe, and it's true, of course, even more tragically in the rest of the world. And I think the most important thing that anybody can do is to try to restore the balance. I call this cultural equity. The slogan is every culture with its equal time on the air and in the classroom. Cultural equity should join all the other important principles of human dignity, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom to work and live and enjoy yourself, and freedom for your culture to express itself. Because that's all we've got, you know. We're just culture.
These concerns of Lomax's were really in play, building up throughout the 1960s, and really found a head, I think, in 1975 when he was engaged as a consultant to the Smithsonian Folk Festival, the Folklife Festivals, and they really found utterance in 1976 when Congress passed the American Folklife Preservation Act, which established the AFC. And that year, shortly thereafter, he wrote a really provocative challenge to the public broadcasting system entitled "We Need a Grassroots Communication System." And this is this voice. There is no more. I've found nothing that sounds more like Lomax than this paragraph right here. I think you'll appreciate this. He says, away with the PBS that acts as a pipeline for megalopolis and the mainstream and cultural mafias into the hinterland. Up with the PBS that courageously and imaginatively takes advantage of the great reservoirs of images, talents, ideas, and traditions in the American land and projects them across the country and out into the world. And Lomax proceeded to outline this three-point plan that was sort of to decentralize PBS, and whose emphasis at the time was on Boston Pops and Masterpiece Theater and Beaux-Arts programming, and which he said only served to conceal America from itself. And he proposed, for lack of a better term, I guess, a states' rights approach to PBS, whereby the system would be decentralized and all 50 states would get their own local bureau with the expertise and the funds, both sort of technical and folkloric, say, to produce programs of local cultural relevance using, local traditions and specifically geared to their constituent communities. As he explained, PBS must make sure that every station has a complement of imaginative and capable producers whose task is to seek out and develop community talents and broadcast resources and folklore in universities, in localities, in the traditions and innovations of the regions, in the troubles and the accomplishments of local surround. The aim is to build the morale and the creativity of the whole country. I've yet to see if he ever received a response to this letter. Todd perhaps would know. I never saw one. I don't think that it reached very high up into the PBS bureaucracy. And needless to say, sort of the structural shift that he was agitating for never materialized. So as Lomax would do, he decided that he would do it himself. And in 1980, PBS did show up to syndicate a film that he had made in 1978 under the auspices of Mississippi Educational TV called The Land Where the Blues Began. And it was shot with cinematographer John Bishop, who was his nephew by marriage, Bess Lomax's Hawes' son-in-law, and a folklorist named Worth Long. And that film was syndicated in 1980 by PBS, and he used it as a bit of leverage with PBS to pitch a more ambitious series that he called American Patchwork, which ultimately became a 6-part nationally broadcast series on PBS, broadcast in prime time, that would be geared to specifically to represent 6 regions of the country as he saw it. Central and Southern Appalachia, Mississippi Delta and Hill Country, Cajun and Creole Louisiana, Mississippi, New Orleans traditions, and a film that actually was never released called Desert Folk from Arizona that was primarily Mexican-American traditions, and the Tono Odom, Desert Apache, and Yaqui Indians. And he also shot some footage of the Italian-American Giglio traditions in Brooklyn, and also went to the Smithsonian Folk Festival and got some pretty phenomenal footage there. So the idea was if PBS wouldn't cover their own beats, if the local affiliates wouldn't, then he would do it for them. And PBS came through with funding for American Patchwork in '81, but not with enough money to pay for film. They only could provide 3/4-inch U-matic videotape, which was more or less state-of-the-art at the time, and some video cameras for shooting. And over the course of, not counting 1978, which was shot on film, The Land Where the Blues Began material, 1982 to 1985, Lomax shot about 220 hours worth of footage using 3/4-inch U-matic tape. Including The Land Where the Blues Began footage, it's about 300 hours of footage. And taken as a whole, I think it's arguable that it was Lomax's most prolific recording trip of all time. And certainly to the point when American Patchwork was edited and aired on PBS in 1991, it reached certainly the biggest audience that any of his material had ever received, in that it was broadcast over many years on PBS, syndicated for a long time. And usually, when it was premiered, it aired, I think, at 8 or something, 9 o'clock in the middle of the week. So it wasn't sort of, shunted until 7 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, which, of course, most of the best public radio and public TV happens to them now. I will, if I may say so. And the American Patchwork fieldwork also was, for all intents and purposes, Lomax's last field documentation trip. He did shoot a little bit of footage in 1991 using a handycam in the Caribbean island of Carriacou off of Grenada to document carnival traditions there. But the American Patchwork was the last of his really sort of great field recording trips. And I don't know ultimately how frustrated Alan was when he didn't get the money to shoot on film. But I will say, by way of a segue, that the fact that he was given videotape made our job at the Association for Cultural Equity exponentially easier when it came time to digitize this collection. It's far cheaper, obviously, to digitize tape, videotape than film. And it also gave us the opportunity to use all of this material and make it available online, which we have done in the past number of years, and I'm getting fully ahead of myself, and we'll come back to it, with the Alan Lomax Archive YouTube channel, which as of last week, if I may say so, has 8.2 million views and over 21,000 subscribers, by and large, all of which was taken from the American Patchwork footage. So what was his sort of biggest trip in terms of reach in 1991 now has an even greater reach now online. But I get ahead of myself, and I'll come back to it here momentarily. So over the course of 5 decades, Lomax's recordings from the 30s through the 70s, through the 60s, were released on well over a dozen labels in America and Britain, primarily LPs. Come the 80s, in fact, New World Records, I think, were releasing them on cassette. And there were a few CDs that came out in the late 80s, but nothing was centralized. There was no one label that was committed to releasing Lomax's recordings, whether under the auspices of the library from 33 to 44 or the later independent recordings that he made. And in 1997, Rounder Records launched what was a very ambitious CD project that ultimately numbered over 100 titles called the Alan Lomax Collection. And it was the opportunity, again, to provide an outlet for, they never tried to make all of the recordings available, but at least to date, the most complete release of Lomax's field recordings. And in 1997, it was a good time to do this because Lomax had at this point suffered at least one stroke, I think 2 by 97, and he was being cared for in Florida by Anna Lomax, his daughter. And Anna, in her infinite wisdom, saw this opportunity that Rounder provided, not just to digitize the material that was going to go on to the CDs, but to digitize the entire contents of Lomax's archive. All of the tapes that he lugged around with him for ages in his office, and were living in his office, what he called his orifice. It's this sort of gaping maw that took everything in and nothing came out of it. So basically, all of his recordings from 46 to 91 have been sitting in the office, in addition to some 5,000 photographs and negatives, and also all this videotape. So between the money that Rounder Records provided and a series of grants from both public foundations and private, we were able, between 97 and 2003, to digitize the entire contents of the Alan Lomax orifice. Meantime, 100-some albums came out on Rounder between 97 and 2004 across his collections. And in 2004, it became clear that the series was running out of steam, largely because the era of the single CD and concomitant outlets for them, such as Barnes & Noble, where most of these were sold or not sold, where it was coming to an end. And this was at the same time when we started thinking about ways to provide access to the Alan Lomax archive online in digital iteration. And I see a certain sort of grace in this attempt at centralization because in the past 10 years, as we've met, I've really labored with our partners at AFC to make material available both online and also in sort of boutique releases since the end of the Rounder series. We've also really labored as one of our essential part of our mission is to, in fact, decentralize the collections and make them available to the communities from whence they originally came, what we call our repatriation programs. And I think in some crucial ways, we were destined for this insofar as that when the Library of Congress, the AFC, took over the physical preservation burden of the office in 2004 and united all of his later post-Library of Congress recordings with the earlier material, it freed us up to rethink ourselves as a digital archive. And we finally moved out of the site where the orifice was for many years, on West 41st Street between Dyer Avenue and 10th Avenue in New York City. And we finally moved out in December, and I wish you all could have seen what an abject dump this place was. I mean, it's just extraordinary how dumpy it was. And to think that that was the site of the archive. We remain so lucky to have had the AFC step in and take over the material as they have done. And it gave us the flexibility and the reach, again, to rethink ourselves as a digital archive. And in 2005, we launched the first iteration of this, which is the Association for Cultural Equity Online Archive. And it gathers together all of the post-1946 tape recordings made by Alan, his 5,000 photographs, and a selection of video material. Basically anything that goes up on YouTube also goes to the ACE site. His radio programs that we have copies of, mostly from the late 40s, from CBS and Mutual Broadcasting, a couple BBC titles, and increasingly many hours of discussions, interviews, and lectures that he recorded himself or had given that ended up in the archive. And increasingly, his performance style and culture research, the cantometrics, choreometrics material that found expression in the Global Jukebox learning tool that was released in the 80s and is now being revived by Anna Lomax and her team in New York. The same time, I think for those of you archivists who maybe are interested in this sort of thing, when this site launched in 2005 was just around the same time that we had undertaken the dissemination program. At the time, file-based formats were sort of not a thing that we were working with. Things weren't in hard drives. We had the archive room at the office was filled with CDs as far as the eye can see. And when we got grant money to digitize the American Patchwork video material in 2003, part of that project was that we were going to distribute all of the footage to the sites where it was made. So, for example, the Blues Archive at Ole Miss, Oxford, Mississippi, received all of the blues-related material from 1978. Ferrum, the Blue Ridge Institute, Ferrum College, Virginia, received all of the Central and Southern Appalachian material. The New York Public Library received everything. The Schomburg Center in New York got all of the African-American and Afro-Caribbean material. What this meant, literally, was that we started boxing up one after another, these massive boxes of just DVDs, basically fourth, fifth generation copies of this stuff, because there wasn't money to go directly from the video to digibeta and then transfer that. Basically, we had to go through 4 different iterations of media to make the stuff available. Long before YouTube, long before we were working with file-based formats, we were working with these massive amounts of CDs. And this meant that we were also able, I'd say, we at least had some means of dissemination. And we worked, as I said, on the macro level with some of these big institutions, even down to one of the smallest sort of dissemination sites we had was to the National Mining Centre in Midlothian, Scotland, Newton Grange, who received 8 songs recorded by one named Annie Cosgrave in 1953 relating to local topical mining songs from Newton Grange, Scotland. As of this month, this is our list of repatriation and digital dissemination sites. The most recent one is the Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky, who just last week received all of the post-1946 Central and Southern Appalachian recordings and photographs. You can see all of those or not. We had a really wonderful experience a couple years ago, and we, again, being a digital archive gives us the opportunity to work very nimbly with local organizations who can take the lead on projects. We love collaboration, and in October 2013, or earlier in the year, we were approached by a crusading librarian named Alice Perotti, who is the director of the public library in Como, Mississippi. And that was where Lomax first made the recordings of Fred McDowell. It's also where he recorded the first fife and drum recordings. That's not true. That's in the Hill Country, he recorded Sid Hemphill in 1942, but he made the first stereo recordings of fife and drum in '59 in Como of Ed Young. And she had us down, and we did a repatriation ceremony there, donating the audio made in '59 and the video made in 1978 to the libraries in Senatobia and Como in Tate and Panola counties. And part of this mission, obviously, is not just to make the stuff available to the libraries, but to make sure that the families of the artists and the neighbors and communities of the artists know it's there. So we invited as many of the families as we could find, and we had an incredible turnout of folks showing up, listening to recordings, singing songs. What we didn't know is maybe you can see in the gentleman in the black cap in the middle is Lonnie Young Jr. I certainly didn't know he was still alive. And he was a snare drum player in the Young Brothers fife and drum band, who Lomax recorded in '59, and he came out for the event. I'm almost sure he hadn't seen the photos of himself that we projected at this event. I wanted to say just a word. I'm doing a lot of talking now. I want to show you some footage before our time's up. Are we doing okay on time, by the way? Yeah. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm more or less a Kentucky native, and for many years I've been extremely interested in Lomax's Kentucky recordings. Lomax, I think, taken as a whole, the largest collection of Southern white material in America, American white folk song and tunes and ballads. Lomax collected between 1933 and 42 in East Kentucky, or of East Kentucky natives who at that point were living somewhat in exile in New York City. And with the support, and again, I think what ended up being a very happy collaboration with the support of the Library of Congress with the American Folklife Center, who digitized the 32 hours of 1937 East Kentucky material that Lomax and his wife Elizabeth collected. They digitized all that material in late 2011. And ACE, with the support of both the National Endowment for the Arts and special collections at the University of Kentucky, we managed to catalog all 37 hours of that material digitally. So go through all of those all of that music, both speed correct it, because many times they were recorded, the instantaneous disc recorder was running at the battery was dying, or there was not reliable current, needed speed correction, and also needed digital cataloging, because Lomax's notes, by and large, were accurate, but there were many spelling errors and songs that were misidentified. Basically, by the end of last year, we were able to put the finishing touches on this catalog that documents all 32 hours of 1937 material. And we launched an event in Louisville called I've Rambled This Country Both Early and Late. That was our attempt to kick off a year and a half of programming in Kentucky that both made the material available to sites around the state, but also brought younger musicians out to interpret tunes from the collection. There were instrument workshops. There was a shape note singing, although no shape note recordings were made in Kentucky. Basically an opportunity to call attention to this incredible repository of Kentucky folk culture that had, by and large, never been available to the public. And I bring this up because this goes on, it continues apace. One of our collaborating institutions was Berea College in Berea, Kentucky. And when I contacted them about being a potential site for the donation of these recordings, a donation from the AFC, and with the support of ACE with a digital catalog, they said, that sounds great, but is there any other stuff that we could transfer? We have some money to provide. To bring more collections into our archive. And they managed to find the money to digitize the other 30-some hours of Kentucky-related material here in the AFC between 33 and 42. And the hope is now, they've engaged me to catalog that material as well. By October of this year, when Berea has their annual celebration of traditional music, all 60 hours of the Lomax's East Kentucky recordings will be available online in some sort of presentation between the Folklife Center, ACE, Berea College, and the University of Kentucky. I feel especially a personal investment in this material, in this project, but also I'm really excited that we can have this sort of private and public collaboration to make this stuff available to the state of Kentucky, and this can be something that we can replicate across all of the collections that Lomax made in Michigan, in Mississippi. I think it's really exciting, and I take this opportunity to thank my colleagues at the AFC for making this possible, because I just came back from the Whitesburg's Apple Shop organization this past weekend in Southeast Kentucky. They're also helping with the project insofar as that they've raised money to do a tour through 9 counties where Lomax recorded in 37 and actually present the stuff to the communities there. There's a lot of excitement down there, and I'm thrilled. So, without further ado, I want to take the pressure off me and maybe off of you and show you a little bit of footage that we have online in the YouTube Alan Lomax Archives channel. Before I show it to you, though, I wanted to read you a bit. This is perhaps the most startling piece of sort of Lomax's prescience in terms of technological prescience, and also, you know, a bit of sentiment, again, to get back to Charles Seeger's complaint with him. In a 1960 article written about his Spanish field trip in 52 and 53, a piece for the Hi-Fi Stereo Review, Lomax said this, 1960, keep that in mind. It's only a few sentimental folklorists like myself who seem to be disturbed by this prospect today, but tomorrow, when it will be too late, when the whole world is bored with automated, mass-distributed video music, our descendants will despise us for having thrown away the best of our culture. I said 1960, but it's 60 or 61. Mass-distributed video music. What is scary to me and remarkable is that the launch of MTV was closer to his writing of that piece than it is to now. And of course, Lomax never lived to see YouTube. He never really lived to see the internet. I think he would have been thrilled by the leveling of the playing field that YouTube and the internet provides, obviously. in terms of cultural equity, in terms of cultural feedback. And I wanted to show this video here because just recently, YouTube has been incredible for us because it has made possible connecting with the heirs of artists who Lomax recorded with whom we've had no contact or had no means of finding them. Of course, we get all kinds of absurd comments all the time. Most of them have to do with blues and how real the blues is and how, well, that's authentic blues, and trash talking Eric Clapton, etc. But this is a video that just recently we had a comment on from a fellow in Georgia. This was a video shot in 1983 at the Mountain Music Park in Dahlonega, Georgia, of Doodle Thrower and his Golden River Grass Band. And there's a fellow who comes out, buddy of Doodle's, named Strawberry Tipton. We had no idea. I've been looking for Strawberry Tipton for years and no idea where to find him. And this fellow contacts or writes a comment on the YouTube video and says, Strawberry Tipton is my father. He died before my sons were born. I just found this clip, had no idea there was any footage of him. And I had the opportunity to show my sons footage of their grandfather performing. It was a very emotional experience for me. We've gotten a few of those comments, and it makes all of the Eric Clapton-related commentary worthwhile. But I wanted to show you this. I love the beginning of this. This is Doodle Thrower again and the Golden River Grass Band. The tune is good, but the introduction is best.
You know, girls, we don't want to start no stampede or a fight or nothing. We realize we've got more than any one woman could ask for already out here. Oh, they're some of the sweetest things, that I have ever seen. Bill, he got his teeth back from his wife. You have got your original teeth in, right? His wife sitting back there snaggletooth, poor thing. What made him do it? She swapped two tapes off for a box of Bruton up at the store. Where's that sweet little, see that precious thing behind the screen back there for me? He won't never find his way out. Oh, girls, hold on to what you got here. Here he comes, this sex idol of Dahlonega, Georgia, the hot lips itself, Mr. Strawberry Tipton. Get in here, Straw.
Thank you, Mother.
Yeah, I'm gonna mother you in a minute. Mother your hind leg, boy, I'll hit you right in the mouth in front of this crowd, too.
My mother-in-law's on the third row.
That's the ugliest woman I ever seen in my life.
Let's dedicate her a song.
Your mother-in-law?
If this cause your belts are slipping, don't mean your gears are stripped.
Well, this year, we're going to do a little old thing called Old Mountain Dew. Round the bend and you come back again with a jug full of that good old Mountain Dew. They call it that old Mountain Dew, 'cause them that refuse that I fuse. I'll hutch up my mug if you fill up my jug with that good old Mountain Dew. Get her, Strawberry. Woo! Well, the preacher rode by with his head high, said his wife had come down with the blues. And he thought I ought to give him a quart of that good old Mountain Dew. They called it that old Mountain Dew, poison that refuse that I fuse. I'll hutch up my mug if you fill up my jug with that good old Mountain Dew. Now, James, woo! Hutch up my mug if you fill up my jug with that good old Mountain Dew. Woo!
I think you get the idea, right? You could see. I realize that we're pressed for time, but you can see that on our YouTube channel. This is, well, we actually don't need to discuss this. How are we doing on time? I do have one more thing to show, but we could wrap it up. I realize that I sort of I overprogrammed the banjo in this presentation, and I hope no one minds. I wanted to end with one thing. This past weekend, again, at the Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky, we had the opportunity to do the East Kentucky premiere of footage that Lomax shot in 1937 during his East Kentucky trip. Very beautiful color footage that was recently color corrected and digitized by Guha Shankar, who couldn't be here today because he's working the desk. I took the liberty of putting a soundtrack to some of this material. It's somewhat loose, but I really was moved by having the opportunity to show this footage actually in East Kentucky, close to where it was shot. I think it's so wonderful. It's got some really great dancing. It's only about 4 minutes long. Is that okay? We have time for that? We could do the, sure, just the beginning. Yeah. We actually go to this. Oh, sorry about that. Oh, well. Well, I tell you what, why don't we do the questions now, and then at the end, if people want to stay, we could show it. Does that make sense? Yeah, how about that? I know people have to go to lunch, so first of all, thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you to Nancy in particular. And I'm happy to take any questions anyone has, to the best of my ability. Yes, sir.
Two things, although maybe events have overtaken what I understand. On your website, it was announced intention to upload the cantometric, choreometric seminar type of, has that been done, or what's your times?
It's still in process.
And it's well worth doing.
Yeah, I can't speak to anything that's happening with the performance style culture. That's all culture research. It's all happening in New York, and I live in Kentucky. So that's my great excuse, frankly.
The other thing is, Alan had a radio show Sunday evenings when he came back from England on WBAI in New York. I don't know if those tapes exist and you have access to them to upload them. I can remember as a kid hearing him extolling the transformation of American popular music with rock and roll, like fee fee fi fi fo fo fum, I smell smoke in the auditorium. He just rhapsodized what was happening, and I think those tapes would be valuable as well to share.
We have never heard them. I've looked for them before. There was discussion they might have found some of them in the WNYC archives, but they're not extant as far as we can tell. Right. They do have some material in the NYC archives from BAI, some of the 50s folk stuff, but it's not the Lomax tapes.
Hey, Nathan, thanks
Hey,
so much for this great presentation. You know, some of what you said about Lomax's reaction to the folk revival reminded me of a different approach which was taken by my mentor, who was Kenny Goldstein. Kenny was younger than Lomax and knew him, and kind of had the opposite experience because he went to Scotland to do his fieldwork just as Alan was coming back. But then he came back and he was a record producer for a lot of the same labels, Prestige and Folkways. And Kenny used to say that his approach to cultural equity, right, was that the folk revival was pumping all this money into folk music. And so he would get a budget to record 10 records for Prestige, and he had to make a certain amount of money on sales from those records, but they didn't itemize it the same way. So it could, you know, if he averaged a certain amount, they'd give him money to make another 10 records. So he figured that, you know, 3 Oscar Brand records could pay for, or 1 Oscar Brand record could pay for 3 Frank Prophet records, right? 1 Kingston Trio record could pay for 20 Frank Prophet records. So his way of doing cultural equity was essentially to use this averaging feature to pay for recordings of traditional music that would get those artists money out of the money that he was making by recording, you know, folk revival artists. And I wonder if Alan ever said anything like that, or saw the folk revival as a potential source for, it's kind of a version of what folklorists always say, you know, if it brings more attention, more money, et cetera, to the tradition, then that's a good thing. But I wonder if Alan ever had that attitude as well.
not that I can tell, but that's not to say he was unwilling to work with sort of more mainstream producers. I mean, first of all, Lomax, I'm really interested to know exactly how this worked, but he was compelled to make a number of records himself in the 1950s. One record was made with the pioneering experimental producer Joe Meek, which is absolutely Lomax's best recorded output. But the idea that Lomax had, well, this was an opportunity to be sort of a gateway drug for the real thing. And Lomax did do, and I wanted to talk about this today, and I don't know that much about it, to be honest, but Alan put together a concert the summer of '59 called Folk Song '59, which was his idea to present music that he felt like was both modern. He was really interested in bluegrass, for one, put on the Stony Mountain Boys, Earl. Somebody knows. The Stony Mountain Boys were led by Earl. No, it was another Earl. Anyway, the Stony Mountain Boys, who were sort of a really, really hot bluegrass band at the time. And, you know, he wanted to put on basically an R&B showcase, you know, featuring some artists, urban artists was the idea, to show that there was folk music also in urban areas, which I find, you know, really interesting. Not revival music, but, you know, sort of native vernacular music. And so he was really, and he did a record for United Artists, in fact, that I think sold pretty well. I don't know how much money he made off of that, but again, he wasn't opposed to working in those channels. And he always said that any money that he made off any of his projects just went back into the next project at the same time. But he also, I think, felt like there were other people doing the revival recordings that he didn't need to be the guy to do that, right? Of course, he didn't know how to really work in a studio either. His great gift was knowing how to mic in a church or in a field or on a porch. He was extremely talented mic placement in those settings.
Maybe just one more question.
Okay. That's me, thanks. I really admired Alan for his attempt to bring vernacular culture to a large audience. Did he ever express any regrets about always working with major labels that in fact dropped the series almost immediately after they'd issued them? Columbia series. You know, he worked to get it to the companies that could have made it popular, but in fact they never did. As opposed to Folkways, for example, where the same record being in print forever meant that the grandchildren of the people who didn't want to listen to it finally heard it.
Sure.
And so it was a very different approach. I just wondered if he ever expressed frustration or regret at the fact here he'd worked to do this and then bang, they dropped it almost immediately.
It's a really good point that I've never considered before. I don't think that he had regrets because he was always on to the next thing, A. And with the Columbia records, I mean, they did 16, 17 volumes of those, at least, you know, went on for a solid 12, 13 years. Come the late 70s when they started doing reissues of the Southern Journey material through New World Records, which was very much a sort of an indie label at the time. And I think that, you know, come that time, he actually used the New World. When you look at those records, he rewrote all of his liner notes to reflect all of his performance style research. It became very much about style, all of those records. I think he always just relished the next opportunity to sort of, you know, repurpose his recordings for whatever he was working on at the time. And I don't know actually if he was, you know, how coherent he was when the Rounder series was launched. I do know that he played a very crucial role in picking songs for the material. But
his first actor, and I said I couldn't produce at that level. It would have been 20 per year, and I was producing 20 per year from the collection.
Right.
So
well,
I appreciated his coming and asking, but I suggest a Rounder because they know Marshall operations.
Thank you. I want to. This could go on continue for a while, but I want to thank Nathan and for coming and a wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, everybody, very much. Really appreciate it.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.